Hello, my name is Elisa Tobin, and I am Role A of the condition presentation about neurocognitive disorder due to traumatic brain injury. Throughout the presentation, I will probably go back and forth between using acronyms for neurocognitive disorder or NCD for TBI or traumatic brain injury and using the full name. And as Role A, I was required to do an overview of the condition. And from the DSM-5, I pulled out the diagnostic criteria, the diagnostic features, the prevalence, the severity ratings, the risk factors, and the differential diagnoses. And all of the information that I pulled out was directly from the DSM-5. And then there will also be a video at the end of my part of this presentation in which kind of explains a little bit more about traumatic brain injury. It's a really good video, and I have it embedded in here, but I also will provide a link for you guys if you would like to watch it. So first is the diagnostic criteria, and the first criteria to meet this neurocognitive disorder, including the traumatic brain injury, is that the criteria is met for major or mild NCD. So in major neurocognitive disorder, there is a significant cognitive decline from a previous level of performance. Also, deficits in this decline interfere with independence and tasks of daily living. The deficits did not occur exclusively in context of delirium, and the deficits are not explained by another mental disorder. In minor neurocognitive disorder, it's very similar, but the cognitive decline is modest, and it still affects based on a previous level of performance. The deficits don't interfere with the capacity for independence. However, a greater effort of accommodation may be required, or a greater effort or accommodation may be required to complete those tasks of daily living. Thirdly, the deficits don't occur exclusively with delirium, just as in major NCD, and also the deficits are not better explained by another mental disorder. You are also supposed to specify whether the neurocognitive disorder is due to Alzheimer's, frontotemporal lobar degeneration. That's a mouthful right there. Frontotemporal lobar degeneration, Lewy body disease, vascular disease, traumatic brain injury, substance or medication use, HIV infection, prion disease, Parkinson's disease, Huntington's disease, another medical condition, multiple etiologies, or whether it's an unspecified neurocognitive disorder. You are also supposed to specify whether or not the neurocognitive disorder includes a behavioral disturbance. The second criteria after the criteria is met for neurocognitive disorders, to include this traumatic brain injury, there has to be evidence of a traumatic brain injury. And the traumatic brain injury can be an impact to the head, displacement of brain within the skull, with one or more of the following occurring in that injury. And it could be loss of consciousness, post-traumatic amnesia, disorientation and confusion, neurological signs. And a lot of times this traumatic brain injury talk has been involved with contact sports. And as you'll see throughout this presentation, that's not always the case. That's not always the reason why traumatic brain injury occurs. And in fact, it has very little to do with traumatic brain injury. There is just evidence of repeated traumatic brain injury that can cause more issues down the road, and I'll get into that a little bit more as we keep going. Neurocognitive disorder presents immediately after the occurrence of the TBI or immediately after recovery of consciousness and persists past acute post-injury period. So these signs are not just like a 2-minute thing, but they are occurring past the time that the injury occurs. And then fourth is to note if behavioral disturbance is present, and that actually changes the coding with the DSM-5. And then finally, you rate the severity of the neurocognitive disorder. So you don't rate the severity of the underlying traumatic brain injury, but you're rating the severity of the neurocognitive disorder. So the diagnostic features. Cognitive presentation is variable, and traumatic brain injury affects people differently. And so some people may experience difficulties with complex attention, executive ability, learning, memory, the speed of information processing, and social cognition. Some traumatic brain injury includes brain contusion, intracranial hemorrhage, or a penetrating injury. But again, not all of them do. Traumatic brain injury can just be an impact to the head. And the ones that do include this brain contusion, intracranial hemorrhage, or a penetrating injury may have more neurocognitive effects. And then finally, another diagnostic feature is that the TBI may be accompanied by disturbances in mental function, by personality changes, by physical disturbances, neurological symptoms and signs, and by orthopedic injuries. Next is the prevalence of NCD with TBI, due to TBI. In the United States, there are 1.7 million cases of this annually, and that 1.7 cases involve 1.4 million ER visits, 275,000 hospitalizations, 52,000 deaths, which seems like a huge number of people to me, which is why it's again important to recognize that although the talk that has been surrounding traumatic brain injury has been with contact sports and professional sports, it is not always the case. So 2% of the population in the United States lives with a traumatic brain injury related disability, and 59% of those are male, so it's pretty even between males and females. And the most commonly, these are from falls, car accidents, and being struck in the head. So just normal accidents that occur every day can result in this neurocognitive disorder, because traumatic brain injury can really happen at any point during this time. And then sport-related is recognized as mild TBI. So even with major contact sports, those impacts are only mild compared to some of the traumatic brain injuries from falls and car accidents and being struck in the head. However, repeated mild traumatic brain injury may have lasting effects. And one of those effects has been studied and brought to the attention of the media a lot lately, and it's CTE, or chronic traumatic encephalopathy. I'm sorry, that one is a little bit tough. Encephalopathy. Okay, excuse me stumbling over that word. But that occurs sometimes in athletes who have repeated traumatic brain injury. And a lot of times CTE cannot be discovered until after death, because it's so mild and hardly ever comes up on the brain scans until they actually study the deceased person's brain, unfortunately. So the severity ratings for traumatic brain injury. We're going to start with just the mild TBI. Loss of consciousness is under 30 minutes. Post-traumatic amnesia is under 24 hours. Disorientation and confusion at the initial assessment based on this Glasgow Coma Scale is between 13 and 15 and not below 13 at 30 minutes. For moderate traumatic brain injury, the loss of consciousness occurs for 30 minutes to 24 hours. The post-traumatic amnesia occurs for between 24 hours and 7 days. And then the disorientation and confusion at the initial assessment is between 9 and 12. For severe TBI, the loss of consciousness is greater than 24 hours. So a lot of times this is for people who have been in car accidents is when I've seen this, or suffered major falls, or have gotten hit by a car or something. I've seen people who have experienced this severe traumatic brain injury and have been in a coma for longer than 24 hours or unconscious for longer than 24 hours. And then post-traumatic amnesia occurs for greater than 7 days. And disorientation and confusion at the initial assessment is between 3 and 8. And I would have to look at the Glasgow Coma Scale to understand more in depth what those numbers mean, but they are significant in this severity ratings for TBI. So risk factors vary by age. The highest prevalence of traumatic brain injury are children younger than 4, older adolescents, and adults older than 65 years old. And the worst outcome, is associated with older age. Secondly, repeated concussions can lead to persistent neurocognitive disorder and neuropathological evidence of traumatic encephalopathy. I really need to learn how to say that word. I can't get it. But again, that is the CTE due to repeated concussions and persistent neurocognitive disorder. And then third is that intoxication may increase severity of the TBI. And finally, the risk factors may be associated with depressive symptoms and loss of emotional control. The differential diagnoses were really minimum, but the first one is that there could be previously undetected neurological complications or chronic hematoma that need to be excluded. Secondly, somatic symptom disorder or factitious disorder could be considered in this. And then third is that post-traumatic stress disorder can occur with neurocognitive disorder and have overlapping symptoms. So that is something else to take into consideration. Here is that TED Talk, and it's titled "A Brain Injury is Like a Fingerprint. No two are alike." And it talks about this guy, Kevin, who has experienced a traumatic brain injury, and how really each traumatic brain injury and each injury and neurocognitive disorder that occurs because of TBI cannot be treated equally, because they are all different and they are all unique to the person, and every person experiences these things uniquely and differently. So I hope that you enjoy this video. I really enjoyed it, and I am going to hand the presentation over to Michelle now, who is going to talk about some of the research that has been done on NCD due to TBI. So thank you for watching this part, and I hope that you enjoyed it.